Hi everyone, I hope this finds you doing well. About 6 months ago, I added to Illuminated Cloud an integration with Klein and Code to create a Salesforce Agentforce Vibes-like environment, because Agentforce Vibes itself is a Salesforce-specific fork of Klein, which is an open source AI tool. Code happens to also be based on Klein, so there's a familial relationship there and obviously a very similar behavior. And then making a turnkey solution with those plugins for the JetBrains IDEs and Salesforce-specific components like the Salesforce DX MCP server and Salesforce-specific rules, things like that, so that it auto-configured those for you, and you ended up with something that was remarkably similar to Agentforce Vibes, including the underlying tool. About 2 weeks ago at Trailblazer DX 2026, Salesforce had several announcements in this area of Agentic AI. Obviously, a lot of announcements around there, but specifically around tooling, including the notion of Salesforce headless, the idea that you have all these APIs that include the Salesforce APIs, the Salesforce CLI, the MCP servers, which now include both the DX MCP server that drives the CLI and the recently GA Salesforce hosted MCP servers that allow you to interact directly with your organization. And things like Salesforce-specific skills, now that skills have become a more standardized notion in this kind of agentic world, and updated rules to help drive things toward those skills and ensure that those skills are engaged and MCP servers are engaged. And so I wanted to revisit this Agentic AI turnkey integration in Illuminated Cloud and try to make it so that not only are all of those new components integrated, but additionally I open it up beyond just Klein and its kind of derivatives, but also enable interaction and integration with other agentic AI tools, things like Claude Code and GitHub Copilot, Windsurf, Zencoder, the JetBrains, Junie, and AI Assistant, things like that. So why don't we just dive into it? So I think the first place to go is going to be the application level Illuminated Cloud settings under the Agentforce tab. And in this bottom section, previously was called Agentforce Vibes. I've renamed it to Vibe Coding because it's no longer about trying to create a drop-in kind of alike for Agentforce Vibes based on the same Klein base, which would be Klein and Code. But instead, it's about trying to create a Salesforce-aware, Salesforce-specific vibe coding environment for Illuminated Cloud in a JetBrains IDE using Salesforce components like their MCP servers, their rules, their skills that they've thankfully made available open source, because they also want their customers to be able to use tools of choice. In fact, if I move over here very quickly, you can see that they've actually created a repository, an open source repository in GitHub that is a curated collection of skills, and similar with the rules that guide the tool to these skills and to their MCP servers. And in fact, this is exactly what I'm bundling with Illuminated Cloud. So like I said, this is effectively taking advantage of Salesforce graciously making all these components available to us in order to be able to use not just their tool, but to use tools of choice. I know a lot of people have been asking Salesforce, how can I use all this with Claude Code, with GitHub Copilot, with whatever it happens to be, with Cursor? And so they've actually documented that. In fact, if I move back over here with the hosted MCP servers, they talk exactly about that, how to integrate their hosted MCP servers with Claude, with ChatGPT, with Cursor, and we'll revisit this in just a few moments in a different context. So like I said, in this demo, what I want to show is how to configure these, and then we'll look at not so much how to use them to generate code, because we've seen that in the past, and we know that Claude Code can generate code, for example, but instead make sure that we see that they are configured properly for all the different components and are very aware of Salesforce ecosystem specific development. Now, because we just touched on the Salesforce hosted MCP servers, I think it makes sense to start with this checkbox at the top. So the Salesforce hosted MCP servers do require authentication and authorization in order to be able to use them. You can't just plug in the URL of your org and have it start interacting with your org. That would be a huge security hole. And that means setting up an external client application and getting the consumer key from it and adding that to the configuration. And there are different ways to do that for different tools. Now, I've tried to make this as close to a turnkey solution as I can within Illuminated Cloud. And one of the ways that I've done that specifically for the Salesforce hosted MCP servers is I've added an option to proxy the Salesforce hosted MCP server requests through Illuminated Cloud. The JetBrains IDE already has a built-in web server that is quite restrictive. It can only take requests by default from like localhost and things like that. It's not going to start fielding things in your local network. And you can, as a plugin developer, you can add extension points that can field requests. So I've done exactly that. And for the requests that come in specifically for Salesforce hosted MCP servers, I decorate those with the access token, the session ID that Illuminated Cloud's already maintaining for you by virtue of you creating connections within Illuminated Cloud, right? So because I already have that, I can go ahead and adorn those requests with the access token and make sure that they're already valid to go to your Salesforce orgs, your project Salesforce orgs hosted MCP servers, so you don't have to set up anything else. Now, this is disabled by default. I understand that people may not want it enabled, but if you do want to take advantage of this, be aware that Illuminated Cloud is not capturing any of this information. None of this gets shared. It's not logged by default. You can turn on debug logging if you want to see on your local machine what's getting sent back and forth, but that's completely up to you. So for this purpose, I'm going to go ahead and enable this, and we can see that it's saying there are no active MCP servers found for this particular connection, Apex recipes. Now I'm going to go ahead and just see. I'm going to query it so that it's live, and it is. And so what I'm going to do is click this button, and it is going to actually open the MCP server configuration in this org in Salesforce setup, so I can go and activate some Salesforce hosted MCP servers, and we can come back and refresh and begin working with those. So this should open in the browser in just a second. Of course, it's always going to take a second longer here when you're in a demo. There we go. Okay. So we should see the MCP servers here, and we do, and we can see that they're all inactive. So why don't we enable, say, S-Object All? I'm going to open these in other tabs. Metadata Experts and Salesforce API Context. And so I'm just going to go over here and say Activate, Activate, Activate. And if we come back over here and we refresh, we should see that we have those three that are active. So let's go back to the Illuminated Cloud settings, and I'm going to say update now, and we can see found 3 active MCP servers for connection Apex recipes, and it tells you this is cached pretty aggressively because I don't want to just query the server every time you open this dialog. So just like with the metadata, the server metadata list, you can go and have it refresh the cache, and you can see it's refreshed now at 45 rather than 27. And if we wanted to go and configure them again, we could click here. But you can see that it added a new section to each of these Agentic AI tools for Salesforce hosted MCP servers. And again, if I turn this off, that goes away. But let's for a moment just assume that you want to have these integrated and you want Illuminated Cloud to help make that easier. So here we are. So now what do we do? Well, the next thing to do is to start installing plugins for these Agentic AI tools and start configuring them. Now, we've seen Klein and Code in a previous demo. For this particular demo, I'm going to do the 2 JetBrains ones, AI Assistant and Junie, and I'm going to do Claude Code because, again, I think Claude Code happens to be a very popular tool out there, and deservedly so. It's a remarkable tool. So let's go ahead and install the plugins. So it's going to automatically bring up the plugin marketplace, and it's filtered by the name of the plugin and by the vendor. I'm going to go ahead and install AI Assistant. Because it's filtered by the vendor, I can see Junie down here. So just to save us a step in just a moment, I'm going to go ahead and use this as an opportunity to install Junie as well. And then I'll close this after Junie's installed, and we'll go back and we'll go ahead and start setting these up. It reopens this, and so let's install the Salesforce DX MCP server. Now, you may notice that was installed at user scope. Let's spend just a moment talking about user scope versus project scope. This is really about where it gets installed. In fact, let's put the hosted MCP servers. Those are at project scope. So we can see here that by hovering that this was installed under my home directory under mcp.json, and this was installed under the project directory. In kind of a parallel path. Now, my guiding principle here on what goes under user and what goes under project is basically if there's anything project specific about it. For example, the Salesforce hosted MCP servers are going to be based on the enabled MCP servers for the project's connection. So that's project specific. Then they should be stored, they should be configured at project scope. If the configuration for the component is project independent, is project agnostic, then it should be stored at user scope. So the Salesforce DX MCP server just says generally only the default server, only the default org should be consulted. And of course, IC sets the default org for you in your project. And so that is already set up properly. So it should be at user scope and it should work across projects. Rules and skills are also generally the out-of-the-box ones are also project agnostic. You can add your own project-specific ones, but for Salesforce general guidance, they're project agnostic. But you may notice that rules here are at project scope instead of at user scope. Skills are at user scope. The rules are at project scope because each of these tools has its own limitations on what level of flexibility is allowed at user scope for defining things or at project scope for defining things. And for example, for AI Assistant, you can have exactly one file at the user scope, kind of an agents.md that it will pick up. And I don't want to just concatenate the Salesforce specific rules onto the one that may be for something else. And so we're putting this in a project scope rule because that's what AI Assistant's limitations kind of require. Similarly, if we go to Klein does not support project scoped MCP servers. So all MCP servers have to be defined at the user level. I hope that makes sense. I said user scope and project scope a lot. Let's go ahead and continue. But the point is that Illuminated Cloud not only will show you where it is, but if you click, and I'll have to drag this over here. If you click, it'll actually take you to that configuration. So we can see the skills here under my home directory, under agent skills. By the way, agent skills is a relatively standard place for skills to go, and several of these tools are going to use that. So we've installed everything that we need to for AI Assistant. Let's move over to Junie real quick since we already installed that plugin. We're going to do the same thing. So the DX MCP servers at user scope because it's project agnostic. The hosted MCP servers are project scope because they're project specific. And then rules and skills are at user scope ideally. In this case, Junie does support that. And so we've put those at user scope. And then let's go back over here to Claude Code. Now we need to install this plugin. So we'll install the Claude Code plugin, say OK, and then we'll install its MCP servers. Now, you notice that the Salesforce DX MCP servers at project scope here, I haven't seen this in documentation, but my experience is while it allows you to configure at user scope and project scope seems to be an override. It's not additive. It seems to be a replacement for user scope. It uses the closest MCP server configuration. That's my experience. That could be wrong, but that's what I've seen. So we're going to put everything in the closest file, or else it won't see the Salesforce DX MCP server. It'll only see the Salesforce hosted MCP servers. And again, rules, it has a similar restriction where the more flexible version of rules need to be at project scope, but we can put the skills at user scope. Again, you heard me say scope about 1 billion times there. Hopefully that all made sense. But these three tools are now fully installed and enabled. Now you may have noticed over here, let's go over and look at the notifications, that some of these said that we may need to restart WebStorm for these tools to recognize the changes. Again, this is based on observation. Technically, it laid down these files and they're there, but I've noticed that particularly Junie and AI Assistant don't really pick up the full configuration until you restart the IDE. So Illuminated Cloud will prompt you about that. So we'll go ahead and restart WebStorm. When it comes back up, we'll see if things are configured the way that we want them and expect them to be configured. And so here's WebStorm. Let's take a look at the configuration. We'll start by going to the IDE settings, and let's go to Tools, and we'll go to AI Assistant here, and we can take a look at MCP. And we can see that the Salesforce DX MCP server is here, and we can see that, and it's at the global level, and we can see that the Salesforce hosted MCP servers are here. We can see that they're at the project level, and you will notice that those are going to localhost 63343. So that is where I have told it that we're going to proxy hosted MCP server requests. Where the port number is basically comes from, we'll come back to this screen in just a moment, but like I said, the IDE has its own built-in web server. Now you notice that it's not the same port. It's not the same port because on another screen I'm running another JetBrains IDE, so there's an effective port under the hood. It'll start here, but this port's already bound, so it found the first kind of adjacent unbound port, and it used that, and I'm able to ask about that, what the effective port is for the running process, and it uses that. And it's worth pointing out that let me scroll back down here, Tools, here we are. AI Assistant MCP settings. It's worth pointing out that when a project is opened, Illuminated Cloud, if the option to proxy MCP server requests is enabled, it will automatically update it so that the MCP server's configuration is current. So this is kind of a living, breathing thing once you've decided to do this. But you can see that these are disabled. So let's go ahead and enable them so that AI Assistant has access to them, and we should see them light up here. The hosted MCP servers, these are the ones that are proxied through Illuminated Cloud, came up first, and then it had to start the local one, the standard IO based one, because it's a process, kind of a heavier weight process in Node, it took a second longer, but it's up. And we can see that it has the global Salesforce rule, and we can see that it has the Salesforce-specific skills, and they're enabled for WebStorm and they're enabled for Claude. It found them as Claude. You may see a prompt up here saying to import them to WebStorm so that it can use them, or I say WebStorm, IntelliJ IDEA, or PyCharm, or whatever IDE that you're using with Illuminated Cloud, RubyMine, PHP Storm, but it'll tell you to import them into the IDE just so that they're available to AI Assistant in addition to Claude, in addition to Junie, whatever it happens to be. But you can see that it found those, and if we scroll down a little bit, we can see Junie here, and we can see that it also has the correct MCP servers, and we can see that the Salesforce DX MCP server is project agnostic and is at the global level, and that the Salesforce hosted MCP servers are at the project level, and they're green, they're all started. So that's a pretty good first take on it, and we can look at Junie's notion of rules and skills in its own settings. All right, so why don't we take a look at what happens here? Let's open AI Assistant, and AI Assistant has access to multiple different engines. It can sit on top of them. By default, it sits on top of Junie, but as you can see here, it can sit on top of Claude or Klein, Cursor. I know that excites a lot of people. Copilot, Code, things like that. And you can also install others, including some open source ones. It's a pretty flexible tool, in part because of the fact that it can sit on top of other agentic AI tools and provide a consistent common interface. So let's ask how it's configured. Tell me what MCP servers, of course, as I'm doing a demo, I'm not typing well, rules, guidelines, and skills are available to you in this project. And I'm going to copy that so I don't have to type that again, since I had a couple of typos there. And let's see what it says. So it should go out and look at its own configuration, specifically through Junie, and it should tell us what it's found. So MCP servers. So it's found the Salesforce DX, and it's found the three Salesforce, so we can see here, one, two, actually several MCP servers and tools. And it has found all the skills, the Salesforce-specific skills, so we can see specialized best practices, UI, app development, general Salesforce development, rules and guidelines. You can look down here and see that it should steer towards MCP tools and use SQL query as an MCP tool instead of CLI calls. That's coming from the global Salesforce-specific rules. It has kind of guidance about the fact that it should always engage MCP servers and skills before it generates code. So that looks pretty good. It looks like it's fully configured for Salesforce Dev. Let's see what happens if I use it with a different engine. Let's use it with Claude. And we'll actually go look at Claude itself and Junie itself directly in just a moment. But right now, let's see what it looks like through AI Assistant. And again, I could do this with Copilot. I could do this with Zencoder, with Windsurf, and Klein and Code. You've seen Klein and Code before. You get the idea. The point is that Illuminated Cloud is setting these up, kind of like I said, a turnkey solution with just a few clicks so that everything is just there and ready for Salesforce Agentic AI development. So MCP servers, we can see the Salesforce-specific MCP servers, plus we can see some other MCP servers that this has available to it. On the rules side, we can see that it picked up the Salesforce-specific rules, and it talks a little bit about what that means. Don't write metadata without using a skill. Always try to use MCP servers. Never call something like this unless a skill has guided you there, so don't just whimsically call that. And then we can see the actual skills that have been brought in kind of categorically. So that looks pretty darn good as well. Let's look at another tool. Let's go to Junie. And we'll just really quickly look at Junie's settings here, and we can see again that MCP looks good. You can choose the model that you want Junie to use. I'm using a less expensive model here. Let's ask it, because we can't see the rules and skills here, let's ask it the same question. So we'll go ahead and hit enter. Now we should see a very similar answer to what we saw with Junie via AI Assistant. It's going to go look at its config files. It's going to look at the current project. It's going to tell you what kind of stuff's available to it. So, so let's expand this and take a look. So here's our MCP servers. So all four of them. So the Salesforce DX and the 3 Salesforce MCP hosted. All the various skills, Salesforce-specific skills categorized, and then some other skills. And then we can see on the rules side that, again, it's very, very specific about the fact that it needs to use MCP agent tools. Here's the Salesforce-specific rules. So that looks pretty good. Again, I'm not using these to generate code right now because we know these tools can generate code. I'm actually verifying that they have all the context that they need to be good Salesforce coding assistants. And then we'll open up Claude. Now, Claude is a little bit different from the others in that it opens Claude Code CLI here in the IDE, but it does have an IDE integration in order to be able to do things like open diffs, to actually manipulate things within the IDE, to get information from the IDE, to get diagnostics. You can see that it's detected that some MCP servers were added and is asking if we want to enable them. So we'll go ahead and enable all those. And we can now see through the Claude MCP command, we can see the MCP servers. We can see that the Salesforce DX MCP server, it has to start a node process, is connecting right now. It may even fail to connect. It's kind of a slower process and sometimes it fails, and we can ask it to start again. While that's connecting, we can take a look and see, for example, the Salesforce S-Object All. We can see the tools that are available to it. We can see all the different tools. We could turn those on and off. We could decide to make them so that they, and see it did fail, make them so that they, while that's restarting, it should start fine now, but make them so that they are auto allowed or not allowed at all, things like that. So we can configure Claude for the various MCP server tools. Hopefully this will start in just a second. I have found that particularly on Windows, this starts a little slowly just because Node tends to be a little bit slower on Windows. But as soon as this starts, we'll go out and ask Claude that exact same question of tell me how you're configured so we can see that you're, reconnected. Okay, so we're good there. All right, so let's ask it that same question. And I'll go ahead and just kind of pull this up so we can see the answer a little bit better. And once it answers, what we'll see is that it's pretty much configured the same. It has access to the Salesforce MCP servers. I'll also show you where it's configured for the IDE's MCP server so that it can interact directly with the JetBrains IDE and actually get information from it, use it to do things like refactoring, things like that. And of course, it has its own built-in MCP servers. I think all of them are disabled by default, other than like file system and such. So it finished. Here's the answer to my question. MCP servers, like I said, here's all the kind of Salesforce specific ones. Salesforce DX, metadata experts, S-Object All. Here's the IDE one. And then, like I said, there are a couple of other ones that are disabled, the Google Workspace ones. Rules and guidelines, it found the global guidelines. It's telling you what those are going to do, specifically that it needs to always consult roles and skills before it does anything. And then you can see all the skills kind of categorically. And then we could have it go out and start cranking on generating some code, or we could add some project specific guidelines to any of these tools. So that's 3 different tools, basically working with them the exact same way, and showing that we have really good Salesforce Agentic AI context. We could do the exact same thing right now with Klein, with Copilot, with Code, with Windsurf, with Zencoder. And again, if you're aware of another tool that I could integrate here, let me know about it. If it supports the qualifications I said earlier of supporting MCP servers, both standard IO and streamable HTTP, and it supports kind of standardized rules and skills, and those are all well-defined locations in the file system, I'll get it wired in, make it very easy to work with. Okay, so that's really what I wanted to show. As always, I say if you find any issues with this, let me know. If you see opportunities to make things more efficient or the configuration to be laid out in a better fashion, let me know. I mentioned already a few times that several of the choices I made here are based on kind of empirical observations and not necessarily based on documentation. And it's possible that those observations were incorrect. It's possible that bugs have been fixed that render those observations obsolete. It's possible that there's another way to do it and I just don't know about it. Let me know if there are ways to improve this. If there are other things that can and should be integrated to help create a more complete Salesforce Agentic AI environment for these tools, let me know about those. And if you just want to share your own experience with it, I'd love to hear about it. I'd love to hear which of these tools you found to be the most productive, not just the tools, but the models within the tools. And have you customized the rules, the skills, the MCP for server configuration to be more effective for your use case? Share that information because it may be useful for other IC users, for other Agentic AI Salesforce developers in general. I think that's it. Thank you very much for your time. Take care.